All right, so this is going to be sort of our introduction to scripting, very basic game inside of Unity. And so let's just start with the project setup. So let's go up to new project in the corner. And you could see here we have Universal 2D, Universal 3D, and I'm using Unity 6 here. I've got some other editor versions in here. And it says this template includes the settings and assets you need to start creating with the Universal Render pipeline. This is what we want. For the name of my project here, I'm going to just call this, really we'll just name this intro to game. This will be like our intro to game development class, and this is just going to be all 3D. So this will be, we'll do 3D here, intro to game 3D. And I'm going to go ahead and leave it connected to Unity version control, not cloud. It says repository details here. I'll let the repository be the name of the game. And then I'm going to go ahead and pause this video and hit create project. All right, so let's go ahead and do layout 2x3. And I'm going to grab my project, dock it down here, and I'm just kind of making space for my scene. And instead of here, I'm going to click these 3 lines. I'm going to do 1 column layout here. Let's go ahead and install some packages that we're going to need when we're scripting our game. So go up to here to Window, go to Package Manager here, and I'm going to look for Unity Registry here, and I'm just going to look for Pro Builder. So here's Pro Builder. I'm going to go ahead and hit Install. Let that install. All right, another thing I'm going to do, and this is probably for a future tutorial if you don't have it already installed, is I'm going to type in input here, and I want to install the new input system. Mine seems to be already installed, so I'm just going to go ahead and update that. All right, with this new input system and Pro Builder installed, I'm pretty sure that's all we need. So I'm going to close out my package manager here. And I'm just going to start to set up my scene. So I'm going to right click inside of this view and create empty. Now an empty game object is really just as a game object, as it says here, but with just the transform component. We have to add the other stuff to it. So inside of here, I'm going to rename this to player. And this is going to just represent our player. I'm going to hit F to focus on this. And you can see where its position is at 0, 0, 0 in the world. If you don't see that, go ahead and hit reset. And what I tend to do is I create a parent object called player, and then I'll right click in here and I'll create the art underneath it. So underneath this, I'm going to go to 3D object and I'm going to create a capsule. And this capsule is just going to represent the player itself. So I'm going to name this player, and then I'm going to do underscore mesh. And the reason for this is I'm going to replace this with the player mesh later on. And I also notice that it's in the ground right now. So if I go to game object here, 3D object, and I just create a plane. Sorry, I have a invisible recording pop-up thing there that I had to move. So plane, you can see the capsule's cutting halfway through. And this plane, I'm just going to rename it ground for now, just so you can see it. I'm going to create the ground using Pro Builder later. Now, a couple things. You're probably like, how is he able to rotate around? I'm holding Alt and left clicking here, and my left mouse button. I'm scrolling my wheel in and out to zoom, and then I can orbit around, or sort of like the camera itself, by holding the right mouse button. If you want to focus on a specific object to rotate around, you can select the object and hit F like Frank or Francine, and hold Alt, and now you can see I'm orbiting around that object. Now for my player mesh, I would like it to essentially be where the base of the player mesh is where the player's point is, right? So I'm going to select my player mesh, and you can see there is a transform here. And on the y-axis, if I type 1 here, you can see it moves it all the way up. Now the other thing is, I have a capsule collider here, and I want my capsule collider, believe it or not, to be on top of my player here. So this is going to be where all of the rigid body, the physics, all this other stuff is. So my player mesh, I'm going to right click, copy this component. I'm going to go up to player here, right click, and paste this component here. So paste component is new, and you can see it went into the ground, which is a problem, but we'll fix that in a second. So this should really only be the mesh. So we need a capsule mesh filter and a mesh renderer. And we get into this stuff a lot more in other tutorials where we actually adjust the mesh renderer. Just realize for now, I just want those two on the player mesh. So I'm going to right click on capsule collider, and I'm going to remove that from my player mesh component. Now let's go up to player, and you can see here that my capsule collider is through the ground, and I don't want that. And that's an easy fix. If I go to my capsule collider here and I just type a number 1 on the y-axis, you can see now it wraps around it. Another thing I'd like to do is add physics. So like when my character moves through the game, it's actually moved by physics. So I'm going to go to add component here, and I'm going to add a rigid body. And what's going to happen is if I lift this up and I want to test my game and I press play, you're going to notice that my player is going to fall to the ground. And that's due to having this rigid body physics component attached to it. Now, generally what I do is on the transform of the player, right now I moved it up, it's at 1. I usually just make it 0.01, so it's a little bit off the floor. And so when I press play, it has like a little fall when it gets there. All right, that looks pretty good. Now, um, we have a player, we have a ground. So let's take a look at creating some folder structure that we can use to set up our character. So what I'm thinking for the first level of our game, or really it would be the first room, is the player picks up some objects off of the floor. They could be 3 food items, and then all of a sudden a key appears, and then you select the key, and then you can go up to a door and open the door. I'm going to use the basic coding to do all of this, but this will kind of get you into the habit of thinking about the way things fit together. And then later, we can always refactor this or repurpose this game when you start to learn a little bit more about systems design. So we have our game set up. I'm going to go ahead and save that. And then I'm going to go up here to Window, and I'm going to do Unity version control. And that should dock it here next to my project. And what I want to do is I'm just going to check this project in. And so we have incoming changes, we have pending changes. I'm just going to go ahead and hit check in. And it says comment is empty. I can add comments or skip check-in. Now, the thing is, let's go ahead and just do add comment. So you can see down here we have comments just for the heck of it. But if you're using the project yourself, I mean, it is a good idea to do it, but you'll probably know where you left off. So I can put a little check in here and say started, or I could just write like project setup. And that way I know, okay, I have my character here, and I'll hit check in here. And now when I go to change sets, you can see, if I move this over a little bit, or actually maybe I expand this out, it should let me move it over. There we go. It says project setup, and this is the first real check-in, right? And so it gives me the date and the time and all that good stuff when I created this. So let's go ahead and back into our project here, and on the assets folder, I'm going to create another folder, and I'm going to call this underscore scripts. And the reason I put an underscore there is it'll keep it at the top. And I generally are accessing scripts. I'm accessing scripts more than anything else. So we're at 7 minutes, so why not create a very basic script where we can move our player around? So I'm going to right-click inside here. I'm going to create a C# or mono behavior script, and I'm just going to call this script player movement. And this, by and large, will control mostly the player's movement. Now, within this, if I select the player here, this script is not going to do anything because this is object-oriented in the sense of controlling objects or thinking about objects. We have a player here. I'm going to go on that player tab there, and I'm just going to grab player movement and drop it on top of there. Now, another thing I'd like to do is go to Edit and then Preferences, and I use Writer. And Writer is very easy to set up. If you need help, let me know. But inside of external tools here, you're going to have Open by File Extension, or you'll have Writer 2022. Go ahead and select that. If you click in here and you don't see Visual Studio or you don't see Writer, you do not want to use Visual Studio Code, by the way, either Visual Studio or Writer. What you have to do is download Writer, install it, and then after you install it, you're going to have this option. The other thing is if we go back inside of here and we go to installs, you can see here's Unity 6. If I click the little cog here and I go to add modules, you'll see there's Microsoft Visual Studio 2022 and it says installed. If you have a little blue check mark there, hit install and go ahead and use Microsoft Visual Studio. That's only if you're not using Writer. So just to kind of give you context to that. So let's go ahead and I'm going to double click on player movement here. I'm going to open up that player movement script. All right, here my script is open. So a couple things going on here. I'm going to zoom in a little bit and I'm going to get rid of these. Right off the bat, by default, you get a start and an update method. Now, I kind of want to get into game development pretty quickly, and we're going to be doing a lot of code that's repetitive throughout the many, many games you're going to write, whether it's in class with me or if I'm mentoring you. And so, which really means you're in class with me. So right off the bat, you get this start method and you get this update method. The only thing you really need to know is in start, when I press play, whatever code we put inside of here, it'll run. Update, it'll run every single frame. Okay, and we have to do some tricks to get things to normalize between different frame rates, but we'll get into that later. And these are called methods. And the way that you can identify a method is it has either void or some sort of data type, a name, and then an open close, these open close parentheses. And then it has an open curly brace and a smaller curly brace. The way you can think about methods are like little machines. And they have a function. Like you can call a method, or some methods are called by default, like start or update. So these are called by Unity the second this script is attached to an object. And what you mean by connected to an object is if you look at player here, we've already attached the player movement script to this object here. So let's go ahead and open up Writer again. All right, so here we are back in the player movement script. So let's talk about something called variables. The two big things that you'll hear a lot about are I'm creating a variable or I'm creating a method to do something. So variable is just a temporary storage place. You can think of it as a cup. So inside of this cup, so for now, we're just going to use public variables until later we'll talk about serialized fields and private stuff. But here we have a public variable. And what this means is we can access this variable outside of the script, and I'll show you that in a second. And we're going to create a of type float, and we're just going to call this move speed. Remember, this script is about player movement. So we want to have a variable that will control the speed in which our player can move. So notice it's public here. And if I make this equal to, let's say, 5f, and I save this, kind of break this up a little bit, you can see when I select my player, it exposed this variable, which is just a cup or a holder that can store float numbers. What is a float number? A float number is any number. It's like it's a number with a decimal point. So I could type 5.1 here, and this is great for incremental movement because if you look at the way our player moves in our scene, if I want to move my character on the X or Y, notice that it has a 1.05 here. It also moves in the negative or positive, right? So if I move it to the left here, it's moving negatively. If I move it to the right here, it's moving positively, right? And if we look at the direction in which my camera is facing, which is back here, you can see this is the camera in which we're looking at our entire scene. So something like this. All right, now, here's our player script. Let's take a look at how we can adjust or use this rigid body, which has physics, to move our player around. All right, so I'm going to create another public variable here, and I'm going to make it of type rigid body. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because I want to be able to access this physics component here. So I just make the variable name the same as the component, which by and large for many things is that way. And I'm just going to say RB, and that's short for rigid body. Now, if I was to save this right now, there's a couple ways that I can access this rigid body here, right? I can, on my player script here, which maybe I'll move this above all these guys. So let me let that compute. I can actually grab this rigid body and I can place it in here. And now that variable gives me full access to this rigid body component. I'm actually going to right click in here and let's see if I can, or I'll click in here and I'll say select none. The reason for this is we're going to be creating something called a prefab, which means I'm going to be taking this out of the scene, or a lot of times you might want to do that in a game, and reload it in. The problem with that is if you do that and I bring it in the scene and I don't have that rigid body always in there, it can break the connection. So a way to do this in order to get this component and automatically load this in during code is by utilizing that start parameter that's here. So I can say rigid body equals get component, and the component I want to get is the rigid body component that is attached to this guy right here. I'm going to put a little mark there, and I'm going to hit Control S to save this. And what we're going to get is, if we go back into Unity now, you'll see that it is empty. It's still empty. And what that is because get component is a runtime command. So that means when the script runs, it's going to find this component and automatically plug it in there. So let's test this out. I'm going to go ahead and press play. I have my player selected here. And what you'll notice is, boom, here's the rigid body component. It found on the player game object the rigid body part, and they plugged it in here, which is great. So now we have access to that. Even though I click off of it and it shows as none, it's always going to load that in for me, which is really, really awesome. All right, so how do I get input from the keyboard in order to move my player around? In later tutorials, you'll use an input manager, which is the Unity's no input system. For this particular tutorial, because I want it to be very basic, what we're going to do is you're going to go to Edit here, and you're going to go to Project Settings, and you're going to look at the old input system. So if you click on Input Manager here, you're going to notice something that says Axes. If I click on this, you'll see there's horizontal, there's vertical, there's all of this stuff here. And there's also doubles of them, right? There's another horizontal down here. This horizontal here is mapped to game controllers, this word horizontal. This word horizontal here, if I select it, is mapped to the A and D key. And this vertical is mapped to the W and S key. Why is this here? It's here to make programming a lot easier for you. So we could just use the word horizontal, and that'll give us access to button presses. So for example, horizontal does A and D, vertical does W and S, and also does the up and down arrow. So let's go ahead and jump back into Writer, and let's go ahead and program this out. All right, so I'm going to do this in update because remember, update runs every frame. So it's always going to be checking if I'm pressing horizontal or vertical. So I'm going to make two float variables. One is going to be called horizontal, but I'm going to make this a lowercase h input. And I'm going to make this equal to input dot get axis. And then what is the axis I'm trying to get? I'm trying to get the horizontal value here. So let's save that. Now, remember, this is mapped to the A and D key and my left and right arrow key. So let's actually just print to the screen or to our console, which is I'll show you in a second. Input from horizontal, just to kind of show you how this works. And then I'm going to do a colon and a bunch of spaces. I'm going to hit plus, and I'm just going to take this variable here called horizontal input, and I'm going to put it at the end here, and I'm going to hit Control S to save that. What should happen is, as I'm pushing my A and D keys, it should register inside of this variable, which only stores numbers, a decimal number. All right, so here we are back in Unity. Let's take a look at that in action, right? So I'm going to hit Control-Shift-C, or you can go to Window, General, and then open up your console here. And you want to make sure that these are sort of pressed in, so otherwise you can't see it. I'll show you that in a second. All right, so I'm going to press play here. And another way you'll know whether these are registering or not is if you press the, you can see here, I'm going to click on this. It says input from horizontal is 0. And that's because right now I'm not pushing anything, right? And if I push the A key here, you'll start to see that this number moves all the way up to 1 in the negative. So I'm going to hold A down until I get to a -1. Do you see that? Now, if I push the D key, you're going to see it moves all the way up to a +1. Now, why is this important? If we look at this player here, right, I'm pushing the A and D key, which is accessing the x-axis. If I move this to the left, it's adding a minus value to our player. If I push the D key, it would be adding a positive value to our player. And then we can use this later to actually move our player around. And that's why this is important. So let's go back to Writer here. And let's go ahead and just program the very simple code that will use our rigid body to add force to move our player from left to right. Actually, before we jump away, I want you to pay attention to this transform here. It has three options, an X, a Y, which goes up and down, and a Z value. Now, we can move this is called a one-dimensional vector can also be a float or an integer, right? So one-dimensional vector means it's just a number of one numbers. Just think about it that way. A vector 3, which is what we're going to be using in a second, takes into account the X, Y, and Z position. It's storing three different values, each one being plugged in as X, Y, and Z in 3D space. So this might scare you a little bit because it seems like, oh my God, I'm going back to linear algebra or something else, but it's really basic. Just understand that, like, if I type in a 1 here, my player is at the 1 position in this world at 1. If I do a 0.01 here, he's just 0.01 off of the ground. So what we have to do is we have to create a variable, and this variable is going to store the X position. So what I'm going to do here, and I can actually just get rid of this line. We've already kind of proven that we know this works. So I hit Control L to delete that, is I can create a vector 3 variable here, and I could just call this move position. And I can make this equal to a new vector 3, just kind of allocating memory there. And within this, if I highlight over this, I wonder if it's going to pop up. It says, yeah, it'll probably give me the X, Y, and Z value here, right? So here's the X, which is 0, the Y is 0, and the Z is 0 here. Now, for the X value here, I can actually just plug in horizontal input here, and it'll actually move it according to the horizontal input that I have inside of this value here. Something else I want you to notice really quick is if I even just type any value, so I do like 0.1 here, and I save this, which I have to put like an F there actually, otherwise it gives me an error. This actually isn't going to move my character. All this is doing is it's a variable of type vector 3 that can store 3 values. I actually have to use the rigid body to move it. So this rigid body, right? So now this rigid body here, this physics system has an actual built-in system for moving things around. So for example, if I type in RB dot and I start typing move position, it actually has a move rotation and a move position here, which is built into this physics. And this has 3 values. So for example, say I don't use this move position just yet. and I just type in 0, comma 0, comma 0 here, right? And I look at this and I'm like, okay, oh, actually, you know what? This takes into account really just one variable, which could be this move position, and it's of these three vectors. So let's say I grab this move position here and I just paste it inside of here, right? Because it already is saving off these three values. Notice it has this 0.1 f here, right? So in theory, because this runs every frame, our character should just move on the x-axis 0.1. So let's save that. Let's go back to Unity. And let's just press play. So now you can see my character moved over just a little bit, right? It moved the position. So let's say we want it to move 1. So let's go ahead and change this instead of 0.1 to just 1f. And our character should just jump. Let's see our character doing that. All right, so now when I press play, you can see that our player moved. Let's see. Looks like our player is continuously moving. It's just moving super slowly on the z-axis. Oh, here we go. So here's X. Yeah, so it's got a little bit of movement going on. There we go, and it's kind of falling over. So inside a writer, let's say we take our move position here, and we take horizontal input, and we just plug it inside of here for the x-axis here. And I go inside of here, and I say, I want to do move position, which is now being controlled by A and D, plus the transform, I think it should be lowercase, dot position. So what is this saying? This object, this player, has an initial starting point, which is 0, 0, 0. So if I take move position on the x-axis and I push A and D here, it's going to take that and it's going to add it to whatever the current position is of my model. So let's go ahead and press play here. And I'll push my A and D key. And you can see now my character is flying and it fell through the floor. So my move speed is actually too high. So let's make that 1. And I'll show you in a way that we're going to actually normalize this so that it's not as crazy. But you can see here I push my A key and my D key, and now my player is moving according to my A and D key. And what it's doing is it's moving this rigid body here. So let's go back here for a moment. And remember, we have a move position here, which is this guy right here. And then we have a transform dot position. But we also have a move speed here, which we can use actually. We can multiply our transform position times move speed. And this will help normalize it. All right, and the last thing we want to do, well, we want to do a couple more things. Let's go ahead and just duplicate this line here and name this one vertical input. Do you remember we looked at earlier that there was a horizontal and a vertical input? Well, vertical is also mapped to the A and the W and S key. So I'm going to grab this vertical input here, or this vertical input variable here, and I'm just going to paste it inside of the z-axis here because the y is our up and down, and I'm going to save that. And now it's going to take move position, it's going to place it in here, and it's going to multiply it by the current transform dot position, which is this object here, transform dot position. So now when I press my WASD keys, I should be able to move my player around. Now, there's one last thing we need to do, because now we have it like working with move speed, right, which we put here, and it's still too fast. The reason it's super fast for me, and if you have an older MacBook, it might be super slow for you, is because we're not actually calculating it by the time that the frames are happening, right? Like I'm getting an insane, I'm sure, frame rate, right? So you can see here when I press play, the frames on my computer might be something like I'm getting anywhere from, like it's shooting up, here's 130. Some computers I get up to 300. So how do we normalize it that we can find the time between frames on anybody's computer so it's always the same? We multiply it by the time of the PC, and that time between frames is called delta time. And now what we get is we're getting something that is a little bit like we're taking into account the move speed, which we can adjust, times time.delta time. And now we're going to get a lot smoother of a movement and not as crazy. So let's move that down. I'm going to go ahead and press play here. And let's hide our stats window here as well. And now when I move him around, you can see my player moves a little bit better. Now it looks like he's sticking a little bit here. And that has to do with essentially our constraints here. Like we can freeze our player's rotation because we don't really need that. And it might be something to do with my, let's see. So my player shouldn't fall down. Looks like my player is still moving. Let me take a look at what's going on in my code. I might have, and he's still falling. Let's try that one more time now that this is checked. Oh, he moves back to position. Okay, we need to fix that. So the issue with this is it's the order of operations inside of this here. We actually want transform.position to be first, and then we want to add to that our move position. That was kind of a simple mistake I had. And we could even wrap all of this inside of here to have it kind of calculate on its own, and then we add that to the current position. So now when we go into our project, our player should just move fine. Let's take a look at this. There we go. So now you can see my player's moving around a bit very slowly. So we can juice this up a little bit, moving a little bit quicker. And then same thing as before, we might have to freeze the position on the y-axis so it doesn't fall over. And then we could fix that later in code. Let's make this like 10. It's a lot better. It moves at an angle, moves back, and then because of the rigid body, you can see that our character will fall on the y. So see if maybe, oh, here's the z-axis. Let's freeze that z-axis. That could have been the issue. Because we still want our player to fall off the map or fall downstairs or whatever if something is to happen. So let's move our player around. I think that should fix it with the freezing the rotation. And then there we go. Our player falls off. I think that's good for this. And then in the next lesson, we'll continue to expand on this game.